Hello, and welcome to episode 37 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Today, we're here with Rabbi Scott Perlo at 609 Historic Synagogue in Washington, D.C. How are you today, Scott?
Pretty well, Jordan. How are you doing?
Excellent. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
I think I need you to redefine the question a little bit and help me understand. I mean, I think there's so many ways to understand what you mean by public interest. Obviously, I come to it from a spiritual perspective, but help me understand what the question that you're asking.
Well, what does public interest mean to you? What is public service? How have you ever done something to improve the state of the world?
I think the question is, it's a very broad question. And so what I want to say is that, I think that the way that I end up working and the way that my life works has a few focuses, right? I mean, I think that what we're trying to do is to work piece by piece and person by person in order to create change and make the world a little better. The way that I think about it, I mean, I think you're using sort of a governmental or a public interest language, but I'm a rabbi, so I tend to use more spiritual language. So I guess the way that I ended up sort of asking myself the question is, how have I served other people? And I think people know the somewhat overused terminology tikkun olam, but how have I worked to repair the fabric of the world around me? I'm very lucky because my job allows me to interact with people in need all the time. People generally don't come to me if they're not looking for something, if they don't need something. And in the Jewish tradition, what we teach is that if God wants to honor someone, if the Holy One wants to honor a person, he sends them a poor man who is in need of tzedakah. It's a very old quote. I think, I haven't looked up the source for a long time, but I think it's in the Talmud. And the idea is that if you want to gain merit in this world, you are given the opportunity to help other people, not necessarily to make yourself famous. So I'm lucky because I'm in a daily basis in the opportunity to help other people. Sometimes those conflicts are very personal, having to do with who people are going to marry and what happens when a mother or father dies, what's going on in life and issues of infertility and questions about how to connect with God or spirituality, or does God exist? So, I get to go home at night feeling not necessarily like, oh, I have the answer for people, but that I was able to be there in a time of need. So I guess my first answer to your question is that I'm simply there in a way that really matters. My dad, who's a psychiatrist, used to say, don't just do something, stand there. And so the first way that I help the world, as strangely it is by not leaving when people are in need and when people are hurt. And that's actually something that's quite underrated.
How do you feel in response to all these individuals with so much need coming to you? Is it ever present a burden upon you? Is it ever a spiritual burden, a burden of time? Is it something that potentially causes stress, or do you just feel so fortunate to be in a position to be a source of strength and light for those who need you?
Well, I'm no angel, that I can tell you, and I think the more years you serve as a rabbi or a clergy member in the public interest, you have to sort of make a choice, a psychological choice. One choice is to let it become a burden, the needs of other people, because other people have a lot of needs, and especially when people are in a state of need or a state of hurt, they're not always polite or respectful about how they express it. And so I think it's very possible for people in any kind of public service to take on the burdens of not only the people that they're serving, not only their burdens, but also how they might, what they might say and what they might do. When people are hurt, they don't always act at their best. I don't see it as much that way anymore. A lot of that is because I've had good teachers who've shown me how to be there. And one of the things I recognize is that I'm there to help, not to take on their problems. Right? Compassion literally means to feel with, compassion. But when I exit the room, I try to let go of the issues that people are carrying, because it's not productive for me to be broken by what is breaking them. We're all broken people. Right? We're all broken people. But ultimately, the job of a friend or of a clergy member or of a rabbi or of a counselor or anyone who's in service and active is not to carry your pain, is to be with you in your pain. Right? If I carry your pain, ultimately I'm actually not helping you out. I'm just taking on something that isn't mine and maybe even making it about me. But if I can be with you in your pain, I can watch and I can listen and I can see what's needed and I can ask questions. And I may not be at the same level where I'm suffering at the same level you are, but I can see how it is that another human being that can help in ways that are small or large. And that's what a good rabbi or even a good friend, a good human being should do. Right? Not necessarily to be in the same place as the person who is suffering, but to be by them and to see how a person can help. And that way you don't take on, in order to do that, you can't take on their burden.
So what separates a rabbi in this particular path from a friend, from a counselor, from somebody else who listens? What is the special niche that you occupy and the skill set that you provide that differentiates you from others who may be listening to this person's problems?
Well, I appreciate the question because there is a difference between a friend and a rabbi or a counselor. And that is that when you're with a rabbi or a counselor, the arrow only really points in one direction. It's not appropriate for me as a rabbi or a psychologist to place my problems in the hand of the person who I'm serving. It doesn't work that way. The power dynamic doesn't work that way. My job is to be there and to be of service. As strange as it sounds, I love the people that I serve, but I'm not their friends. Because if I was their friend, I would be expecting friend-like things in response. I'd be expecting them to take care of me the way that I am, in fact, charged. It's my job to take care of them. And there are ways in which that changes the dynamic. I want you to imagine for a second that you're with a friend and something very difficult is going on in your life, right? You're pouring your heart out to them, and then a week later they're pouring their heart out to you, right? Which seems totally normal. But I want you to imagine that that's your psychologist or your rabbi. That one week you're pouring your heart out to them, and the next week you come into their office for your weekly session with a psychologist, and you're like, things are really bad with my wife this week. Right? It would feel inappropriate because people who step into serving roles, in many ways, what they're doing is something different than being friends. Right? They're being witnesses and guides to your trouble and to your difficulty. In order to stand in that place, in certain ways, the people who are serving need to have their own needs met elsewhere. That's why it's incredibly important for people in public service to make sure that they have someone who can serve them. For rabbis to have a rabbi, for psychologists to have psychologists, for politicians to have politicians, and for leaders to be followers of someone else. You can't get your needs met by the people that you serve. You can get a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction and love and connection and real community. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you want to step into a leadership role and a leadership position, you need to have someone else in this world for whom you are not their leader, you are their follower.
Now, you mentioned that, yet, so I'm going to ask you about whether you feel you have a calling to be a rabbi. The reason I ask is, obviously, we're speaking about needs. Mm-hmm. I would hope or would potentially presume that being a rabbi actually does meet some of your needs, right? That may work with your personality. There's something that you aspired towards. You don't accidentally wake up and become a rabbi. So how is it that being a rabbi and providing this caring, as you mentioned, tikkun olam, which to our listeners, as we mentioned on a previous episode, means to repair the world. It's a Hebrew phrase. How does being a rabbi meet your needs, and how did you come to recognize that it would, and that you had a calling, and that this was a path for you?
So I do want to say, though, that I did actually sort of trip and wake up and become a rabbi, just for the record. I didn't really know what I was doing when I went to rabbinical school. Most of the biggest decisions in many of our lives are not considered decisions, right? And we have to recognize that our instincts know things about us that we will spend the rest of our lives discovering, right? So the career paths we choose, the mates we choose, the partners we choose, the friends right? The places that we situate ourselves in lives, that's because we are like icebergs, and there's much more going on beneath the surface than there is up above. And all of us are guided towards certain paths by things about ourselves that we don't yet understand, right? And you spend the rest of your life trying to understand it. In my case, when I became a rabbi, I was 19 years old, and a rabbi of mine who I was speaking to on the phone just said, just go to the seminary and get it over with already. And I hadn't ever thought about it. In that moment, I said, yep, that's what I'm going to do. And that's how it happened. And it was only after the fact that I discovered what being a rabbi was really all about. So what I'll say is that there are pieces of being a rabbi or a public servant that obviously intersect with my personality. If I were ever to give career advice to a person, I would say do what you're good at. Right? Not necessarily do what the world needs. Do what you're good at and then shape it to what the world needs. Because you should use whatever tools you have, right? At the end of the day, you have to come home happy and satisfied and feel like you can do it again. And so you do what you're good at, because often what you're good at makes you feel like you're worthwhile in this world. And that's why I became a rabbi. Not because I was such a good rabbi, but because I loved books and cared about God, was interested in other people, and the Torah really spoke to me, and I thought, yeah, I just want to do that for the rest of my life. The weird thing is, though, is that when you become a rabbi, what you realize, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're trying to facilitate it for other people. Mm-hmm. So like most people in service professions, what you find is that your job deeply fulfills you and leaves you deeply unfulfilled. That's what it means to be a leader, right? Because what you're doing is trying to take care of other people, and inevitably, in that process, it means that certain things that you want and that you would prefer are sublimated, right? I want to pray a certain way. I want to read a certain book. I want to teach about certain things. But to be successful as a public servant or as a servant of anything, and I think of myself, if you'll forgive what sounds like pretension, it's a little less ridiculous in Hebrew, but like as a servant of God, that's who I am, that's what I do. It's part when Ana Avda de Kucha Brichu is how it's said in Aramaic. I'm a servant of the Blessed Holy One. I think we all are, but I sort of chose it, willingly, and that's who I want to be, or at least who I aspire to be. And when you're serving other people, right, there's always this deep interplay between what you would prefer and, frankly, what they need. And those two things aren't always the same. And that's why it's so important that if you are a leader, you become a servant. And if you are a servant, you also find someone who can help fulfill your needs outside of the work that you do.
You mentioned an interesting thing a moment ago. You said, become what you're good at, do what you're good at, and then use that to serve the world's needs.
Yeah.
There are many individuals in this world who try to find what they're good at and serve their own needs, or who seek to serve their own needs even if it's not what they're good at. But that second part, and use what you're good at to serve the world's needs, why is that in your worldview? How did you come to the point where that was meaningful, where that was important, where that was an imperative, that was almost a natural law for you, which is serve the world's needs through what you're good at? Why serve others? Why not just serve yourself?
So one of the things I want to say, that the wisdom of the Torah is that it's a deeply psychological book. At one point in the Jewish people, when they're receiving the law from God, say, Na'aseh v'nishma, which means something to the effect of, first we'll do it and then we'll understand why we're doing it. So one of the things that I want to say about the question you're asking is that it's valuable to accept as a principle that you have to serve other people or that you have to serve the world before you understand why you're doing it. Right? Certain things are wise, and wise in ways it takes years to get to an understanding to, and that I think it's worthwhile for people to accept and sort of bring into their life as a precept, and not deconstruct. And one of them is that you have an obligation to serve other people and serve the world. If you do it for long enough, or if you see yourself doing it for long enough, eventually what at least I realized is that at the end of the day, we're all family, Jordan. We're related to each other. Most of the we don't always get along with our cousins. That's what family is about. But there are two ways of seeing the world, I think. One is that we're fundamentally separate, and the other is that we're fundamentally joined. And if you are, like I am, a monotheist, right, and you believe that God is one, it tends you towards thinking that we're all one. And if you have as your perspective I think, this is, I think, what the rabbis were trying to teach. If you have as your perspective, right, that everything is connected, it becomes essentially somewhat harder to view other people as fundamentally different from you. And so then if they're family, then they're family, and you have to treat them like that. You have to help them. That's what family's about. That's sort of how I came to the understanding.
So I'd like to bring the conversation back towards your metaphorical family. Mm-hmm. We're sitting in a historic Sixth-and-I Synagogue in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
This is your congregation. This is actually a special place in D.C. There are many events. It's become a national stop on any serious book tour.
Yeah.
It's become a place of congregation as a noun for individuals, many of whom are not even Jewish. Mm-hmm. It has become a nexus of conversation, of celebration of life, of social activities, of spiritual activities. What is special? Obviously, I just named a few things, but why are you here? What is special about this community, about Washington, D.C., about Sixth-and-I in particular?
Well, Sixth-and-I is a very special place, and I feel like I get to say that, not the least of which because I didn't create it. This was something that I lucked into, and when the job came on the market, I was just hoping, that I would be able to do it. I think one of the reasons that Sixth-and-I is so special is that it does create a space in which I guess I would say the boundaries don't matter nearly as much. Look, I'm a believer in difference. To contradict what I just said, I do think it's important that we're all different people. It makes life interesting. It makes life exciting. I'm not interested in homogeneity. But just because we're different doesn't mean we should be separate from one another, right? And one of the most fascinating, one of the most exciting things in the world is to be in a space or to be included in a kind of work in which you're actually with people where the boundaries are kind of eroded, where life isn't so siloed and people aren't so different from each other. And I love Sixth-and-I because it's a place in which, for reasons that are totally crazy, a lot of different members of a lot of different kinds of people in D.C. will end up meeting. And I don't know if you know this, but geneticists have a term they call hybrid vigor. You ever hear about this?
Mm-mm.
So, just to go back to high school biology for a second, when the monk Gregor Mendel was putting around in his garden with beans, discovering how the basics of genetics worked, what you found is that if you breed, the same kind of beans with essentially their mirror images, eventually the breed becomes weak. And combining things that are only alike together produces a certain amount of sterility. And what he discovered is something called hybrid vigor, which is if you take one kind of plant and you breed it with another member of the species that is significantly different from it, the new resulting plant tends to be stronger than either of its parents. And I think that's true about Sixth-and-I too, and I think it should be more true about the world in which we live, is that when you combine opposites, what comes out of that space is often something unexpected, wonderful, and better than you could have imagined. And I think that's what's partially magical about Sixth-and-I, is that you get, both Orthodox and Reform Judaism here, right? And you get Christians and Jews, and you get black people and white people, and there was Harry Kondabolu was here the other month ago, the comic, so there were a lot of South Indians in the audience. And when you create a space that mixes all those different types of people together, sometimes the product is really special.
Now, on the topic of dialogue with difference and producing something special, often in the midst of negative national discourse about everything, from politics to you name it.
Yeah.
It seems to many people that the Congress and that the general country has actually stopped talking to each other, and that we've become more polarized, and we seek news sources that reaffirm our own beliefs, and that there's less of a seeking out of and conversation with difference. How can the lessons learned in your synagogue be applied to a broader national community that lacks dialogue and yet needs all those positive, magical products associated with dialogue from difference?
Well, having a comedian around certainly helps, it sort of makes everyone comfortable. I wish I knew better how to answer the question. Because there's this decision that gets made. When there's a decision that gets made and is being made more and more often, which is to look at someone who's different than you and to see them as not like you. The Torah commands ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And what it means is something to the effect of what that other person wants should be about as important to you as what you want. They're about as important as you are.
Is that possible for most people to achieve?
It is, but you have to make a certain decision, right? And that's to choose to see other people as important as you. And for various reasons, right, when that involve both fear and pride, and sometimes they're justified and oftentimes they're not. Ultimately, we start seeing people as fundamentally different than us. And we see them as fundamentally different than us, it means that we'll treat them fundamentally different from the way that we will treat ourselves. That's what's going on in this election, right? Is that the vast right wing of this country has looked at a number of, the people who are here and said, you are too different to be similar, if you know what I mean. You're too different to be part of us. And when that happens, it's very dangerous. It's the most dangerous thing in the world. Because once I have recognized you as being fundamentally different, I can't hear what you're saying anymore.
And what happens when you're not able to hear and witness what someone else is saying?
The person doesn't matter to you. And when they don't matter to you, you're willing to do some pretty terrible things to them. I mean, I don't want to go down the complete slippery slope of like Nazi Germany, but that is the truth of it. If you see someone as fundamentally different than you, ultimately, and you see them as what they want, not being as important as roughly as important as what you want, then you will treat them differently and probably not well.
So as we near the end of the podcast, I'd like to ask a final question that refers back to something you said earlier today, which is you spoke about somebody coming to you with their problems and you being there for them.
Yeah.
You being a witness, you encountering their pain with them, not taking it on, but being there with them while they endure their pain.
Mm-hmm.
You have done you've contributed much to your community. You have made choices that led you to serve your community, sometimes at the expense of serving your own interests, which you alluded to earlier. Why is it that you've chosen to tread this path? Why is your path meaningful to you? And what is the real value of a meaning and motivation for witnessing someone else's troubles alongside them?
I get up in the morning and I know that I have a chance to help, and that's enough for me. Look, we're all trying to get better. We're all trying to be better. I know it. We worry about who we are and whether or not our life, the way we live, is worthwhile. Whether or not the goals that we are pursuing are good goals. And we wonder about what our purpose is. And I think it's possible to fall down like an existential rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland, and just to really lose a sense of, you can go so far down that you can lose a sense of the questioning, go so far down questioning one's purpose that you can lose a sense of really any kind of connection to daily life, and the reason I'm grateful for my work is that I have been able to actually to reduce some of the existential questions that I ask to very small questions, which is, did I help someone today? And it turns out that that's enough to live. In fact, more than enough to live. And then if you can find something that you do, that at the end of every day you can ask yourself the simple question, was it worthwhile? Was today worthwhile? Then you'll live a happy life. The formula is not complicated. It's just figuring out how to make, to find the right pieces for it.
So Rabbi Scott Perlo says that there's a gestalt in life where you have a metaphysical narrative, a sense of meaning, which you may not understand when you first begin treading down that path. But every day, focusing on action, on doing, on being there for others, on recognizing the humanity that we all share, on seeing another person and recognizing similarities and seeing them and their pain and their joy and everything that's in them, and seeking merely to just be there for them when they require help. That is meaningful. And to do that every day over the course of a lifetime will lead to meaningful days, which will lead to meaningful months, years, and lifetime.
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you so much for joining us for episode 37 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where I interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Thank you for joining us, and we will speak to you next time.